Welcome to the Knowing Moments. I'm your host, Chik. This is a space where we explore the quiet turning points in life and career. The moments when something shifts inside you long before it leads to clarity and change. Because some of the most important decisions we make don't happen all at once. They arrive slowly, almost quietly, as a question that keeps returning, a feeling you can't quite ignore, a moment when something inside you says, something needs to change. This podcast is about those moments, the moments when the noise fades away, when you stop negotiating with yourself, when clarity begins to emerge, even if you don't yet know what comes next. I started this podcast during a sabbatical, a rare pause after nearly 3 decades working in the tech industry. For most of that time, I was moving at full speed, leading large organizations and operating at a global scale. And for a long time, that pace felt normal. Until one day, I stopped, and something unexpected happened. Today's episode is called The Shock of Slowing Down, and it begins with a simple question. What happens when you finally stop moving? To explain that, I need to start with what life looked like before I paused, because context matters. I've spent almost 3 decades in the tech industry, and in many ways, I grew up at Microsoft. I started there as an intern, then became a software developer, and over time, I took on larger roles, leading bigger teams and operating at a greater scale. I worked across multiple products and organizations, learning what it means to build systems, scale them globally, and then lead through constant change. Along the way, I became one of the most senior female product leaders at the company, something I'm deeply proud of, and something that also came with a lot of responsibility, expectation, and pressure. But what mattered even more than the titles or roles was the pace. Because by the time I stepped into my most recent role, I was running one of the largest online services in the world. I was leading several thousand people and are responsible for platforms that millions of customers and billions of users rely on every single day. The scale was enormous, and so was the responsibility. My day starts early, very early. I was usually up by 5 a.m. My morning routine was non-negotiable. I worked out for almost over 2 hours every day, partly because it kept me in great shape, but mostly because it was the only way I knew how to clear my mind before the day began. That routine was my buffer. Before my first meeting, I'd already caught up on emails, sometimes during my elliptical warm-up. Trust me, I've learned many ways to multitask efficiently over the years. Once the day started, it moved fast. 7, 8, sometimes 10 or 12 meetings, different groups, different decisions, different kind of pressure, and in between, a constant stream of emails, messages, pings, and requests. There wasn't a clean separation between one thing and the next. And there wasn't really an end to the day either. If I wasn't in a meeting, I was on my screens. And if I wasn't responding, I was catching up. If I wasn't closing out today, I was preparing for tomorrow. At any given moment, there were dozens of inputs competing for attention. Over time, my brain became trained, almost wired, to respond to multiple signals at once. To stay alert, to stay available, to stay on. For a long time, that pace felt normal. Demanding? Yes, but familiar, even validating. And it's important to describe that rhythm because that's the context in which the pause became necessary. From the outside, everything looked fine. Actually, more than fine. I was busy. I was engaged. I was productive and making an impact. My calendar was full. My days were structured. By conventional measures, I was moving forward. Even rest had a purpose. Not really rest, but recovery. Something to manage so I could perform again. And I didn't question that for a long time. Because when things are working, the system doesn't feel broken. It feels responsible. It feels disciplined. It feels like momentum. But underneath all that motion, I wasn't giving myself space to think, not deeply. Even when I wasn't working, I was still mentally sprinting. Looking back, I realized I was very comfortable being busy because being busy meant I didn't have to sit with uncertainty. Slowing down felt like falling behind. There was no dramatic burnout, no breaking point, just a quieter realization. I was moving fast, but not always with intention. I didn't yet think I need a break to reset, recharge, and reflect. I just knew I was curious about what would happen if I stopped running at full speed. But curiosity alone wasn't enough to act on it. My hesitation didn't come from doubting my commitment. It came from responsibility. I was leading a large team doing mission-critical work, the kind of work where decisions matter, where people rely on you, where customers and outcomes don't pause just because you need space. I felt accountable to my team, to our customers, to the organization. There was also the fear of being out of the loop, of losing momentum, of slowing down and quietly setting myself back. And then there was a question I didn't want to say out loud. Will I hurt my career by doing this? These weren't irrational fears, which is why the decision didn't happen overnight. It took planning, many conversations, and a carefully thought through transitions, coverage, and timing. Despite all the responsibility, I knew I needed to pause, not to escape, but to recharge, to reflect, to gain perspective I couldn't access at full speed. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It was being brave enough to do something I hadn't done before. After all, I had never taken a break since the first day of freshman year college, and that's over 3 decades ago. At some point, the internal knowing became louder than the external noise. I was still nervous, but I moved forward anyway, not impulsively, thoughtfully. I think we are often taught to believe that when we slow down, relief flows immediately. That once you step away, you will just exhale. That wasn't my experience. The first week of my sabbatical felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. On day one, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I turned off all work-related notifications. I moved the work email and the messaging apps to the fourth page of my phone. And yet, without thinking, I still found myself swiping 4 pages over, pulling down to refresh and check for new messages. Over and over again. It honestly felt like withdrawal. Like my brain had been trained to expect constant stimulation. And suddenly, it was gone. The world felt quiet. Empty almost. Too still. There was a loneliness to it that surprised me. And then, unintentionally, I got lucky. We had already planned a trip to Antarctica, and it started just one day after my sabbatical began. Before the sabbatical, I remember thinking, what a mistake. Who starts a break with an expedition to Antarctica right off the bat? But as that first day unfolded, the stillness I felt made me realize something. This trip was actually a blessing. I had exactly one day to prepare. And let's be honest, if you forget something, there is no Mall of Antarctica. So day one of my sabbatical turned into a mad rush of packing and multiple trips to REI. And in hindsight, that busyness helped. It filled the gap that's left by not constantly checking messages. It eased the transition. It helped break the habit. Once the trip started, something shifted almost immediately. My mind felt clearer, like it suddenly had space again. During that time, a friend introduced me to the Acquired podcast. Each episode is 3 to 4 hours long, which initially sounded intimidating, but it turned out to be perfect. I'd just gotten new AirPods. My workouts were already over 2 hours long, and at 1.5x speed, I could almost finish an episode each morning in the gym. I loved the stories. Iconic companies, founders, decisions, strategy. What surprised me most was how energized I felt. My mind felt open again, curious, absorbing. Part of me thought, why didn't I do this sooner? And then I realized, before the sabbatical, my mind was so oversubscribed that I didn't actually have the capacity for this kind of learning. That was the first real shift. After Antarctica, the sabbatical flowed straight into the holidays. Time behaved differently. Days passed quickly, almost too quickly. For the first time in years, I wasn't counting every minute of my morning routine. I let myself slow down. I lingered. I took extra time. Second coffee, third coffee, sometimes a fourth. I slept more, read for fun, played board games, and built Legos with my family. And yes, I still love Lego. There's something deeply satisfying about following instructions and finishing a physical task with your own hands. Taking the time to slow down, relax, and recharge also meant something else. I suddenly had more energy throughout the day. During the holidays, I used that extra energy to reconnect with friends. We were invited to a New Year's Eve party. And I should pause here because I hadn't been to a New Year's Eve party in over 10 years. In recent years, I could barely stay awake past 9 p.m. But this version of me, the sabbatical me, decided to try something new. So I said yes. And it turned out to be a perfect night. It was a small gathering, just 3 or 4 families and close friends. There was great food, good drinking, and long conversations. We caught up on travel stories, on life, on everything that usually gets compressed into quick check-ins. What surprised me the most wasn't the party itself. It was how I felt. I had energy. I had curiosity. I found myself genuinely enjoying meeting new people and hearing their stories. One of the highlights was talking with a couple of college-aged kids in that group. We talked about AI, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, the kinds of conversations that are fueled by possibility. I love the energy of these young kids, their willingness to experiment, their comfort with uncertainty. Honestly, they sparked something in me. I remember thinking, why don't I take more risks? About another week into the sabbatical, another feeling surfaced, a very familiar one. Despite all the learning, especially consuming podcasts about business and AI, I didn't feel productive or accomplished. That internal drive kicked in, the one that measures days by output. And suddenly, I felt an urgency to create structure for myself, which in hindsight is a bit ironic. When I first envisioned this sabbatical, one of my hopes was not to have a schedule or an agenda. For decades, almost every minute of my work life has been structured. Meetings, deadlines, deliverables. Is it any surprise I felt a little lost without that structure? Unanchored? So I created something simple. I called them focus hours on my calendar. I blocked time from 10 to 12 and 2 to 4 on weekdays. Not rigidly, but intentionally. Of course, there were interruptions, appointments, commitments, real life. But what this gave me was choice. It allowed me to be more deliberate about how I spend my time. A couple weeks in, that light structure helped me settle into a rhythm. I'd often start focus time with some intentional reading. Lately, the Daily Stoic. Then I'd catch up on AI, tech, and fintech news. And as part of my sabbatical goal, I wanted to explore something new. This podcast. Those focus hours became the space for that exploration. By the time January arrived, I had found a rhythm. I felt re-energized about learning, reflecting, and experimenting. And then, almost overnight, the world snapped back into motion. Everyone else returned to work. Schools were buzzing at drop-off, pick-up, and recess. The holidays were over. In December, between Antarctica and the holidays, the sabbatical fit naturally. In January, it felt awkward. I felt out of place, a little alone, and more than anything, unproductive. It wasn't just about needing better structure. It wasn't something focus hours alone could fix. I realized I needed to rediscover and redefine what productivity meant, what impact meant, and ultimately, who I was outside of my job. For most of my career, productivity meant goals, deadlines, and deliverables. So I gave myself something I called a sabbatical exit goal. And in my case, that goal was simple but meaningful: to release a fully produced first episode of this podcast and to learn everything that came with doing it. As I reflect on these first 6 weeks, I can see how many learning moments only appeared because I took that first step to pause. The learning moment number 1, mental overload is invisible. I didn't realize how full my mind was until it finally had space. My body wasn't exhausted, but my thinking had been overcrowded for years. Stepping away revealed how little room there had been for curiosity, learning, or reflection. That was the first knowing moment. Sometimes what we need isn't rest for the body. It's space for the mind to breathe. Learning number 2, slowing down needs intention. Removing a packed schedule brought relief, but not meaning by itself. Without intention, time stretches and blurs. What surprised me most was this: ease and intention aren't opposites. A slower pace still needs direction, not rigid structure, but deliberate attention. Learning number 3, productivity and identity are deeply connected. When work disappears, familiar markers go with it: meetings, outputs, clear impact. Without them, I felt both free and unsettled. It forced me to notice how tightly identity can be tied to productivity. I don't have that fully resolved, but recognizing the attachment and sitting with the discomfort felt like progress. Sometimes clarity doesn't arrive as an answer. It arrives as a better question. What stands out most from these weeks isn't a breakthrough. It's awareness. This pause isn't about stepping away from ambition. It's about learning how to listen more closely to signals I had been overriding for a long time. So I will leave you with this question: where in your life have you felt the need for change, but haven't fully listened to it yet? You don't need to act on it, just notice it. Because sometimes awareness comes before clarity, and sometimes clarity begins with a pause. Slowing down didn't immediately give me answers. The first thing it gave me was space. Space for curiosity, for reflection, and eventually for new questions to emerge. And those questions led me into a series of experiments, exploring new ideas, new environments, and new ways of thinking about work, identity, and what might come next. That's the journey I will share in the episodes ahead. Because the biggest shifts in our lives rarely happen all at once. They unfold through a series of quiet moments. And when you know, you know. This is the Knowing Moments. I'm Chik. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next episode.